Every employee at Blackthorn Mobility Systems received an invitation to the celebration. Every single one except Nolan Pierce. While the CEO raised a glass in a chandelier-lit ballroom over a contract worth $1.8 billion, the single father stood alone on the production floor, coaxing a line controller back from the edge of a thermal failure that no one else in the building could have caught. He filed his final warning report at 4 in the morning, accepted a long-ignored invitation to travel to Stuttgart, and turned off his work phone before the plane left the gate. 50 days later, Nolan Pierce returned to Cleveland to find an empty parking lot, a collapsing stock price, and a factory that had nearly stopped breathing. If you believe the people no one thinks to invite are usually the ones keeping everything from falling apart, stay right here, because the collapse was only just beginning. The invitation had gone out on a Thursday, and by Friday morning every desk in the building held a cream-colored envelope. The catering company, the front desk staff, even the 2 technicians who had started 3 weeks prior, and still had to ask where the restroom was. Blackthorn Mobility Systems had secured a supply contract worth $1.8 billion with one of the largest electric vehicle manufacturers in the country, and Vivian Blackthorn had decided the moment deserved a celebration proportional to its scale, which meant a rooftop ballroom in downtown Cleveland, an open bar, and speeches long enough to fill the evening. Marcus Bellamy, the floor supervisor who had worked alongside Nolan Pierce for 11 years, noticed the absence almost immediately, not because he was looking for it, but because the name he expected to see somewhere in the acknowledgement simply was not there, not on the envelope, not in the program, not on the guest registry at the door. He found Nolan in the break room that evening pulling on his work jacket, his phone showing a thermal alert from the primary assembly controller, and when Marcus told him what the list said, Nolan stood very still for a moment before nodding and saying there was a drywall emergency to handle anyway. Preston Caldwell, the chief operating officer, had reviewed the guest list personally and drawn a line through Nolan's name with the annotation that maintenance staff carried no executive relevance to the contract signing. An assessment that ignored the fact that a significant portion of the technical specifications used to win that contract had come directly from documents Nolan had written and submitted under the Operations Integration Team header. Emery Pierce, 18 years old and finishing her first semester studying mechanical design, had called her father that afternoon and told him in plain terms that a company that did not put his name on the list for a party it was throwing with his work had no claim on his conscience that evening, and Nolan thanked her, hung up, and drove to the plant. He spent the next 4 hours recalibrating a thermal press that had begun introducing micro-variants into the component tolerances at a rate that would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't spent years memorizing how that specific machine behaved under sustained load. And by midnight the line was stable. A batch of components that would otherwise have shipped with latent defects had been flagged for reinspection, and Nolan had placed a written warning report in Marcus's in-tray, noting that the corrective adjustment was temporary, and that the underlying issue required a firmware review he had now requested 4 times in writing. He stepped outside, and Marcus came after him and showed him a photograph on his phone. Vivienne Blackthorn at the center of a glittering room, her glass raised, surrounded by every manager and director in the company, every face bright with the certainty that they had built something worth celebrating. And Nolan looked at it for a long moment before handing the phone back without a word. Then his own phone lit up with an email from Stuttgart. The message from Kessler Work Automation had been sitting in his inbox for 72 hours, addressed to him directly rather than to the company routing address, because the German firm had learned from experience that routing to Blackthorn's management layer meant routing into silence. The partnership program was a 50-day technical residency for systems integration specialists, and the original Blackthorn designee, a regional operations director chosen by Preston because the title sounded appropriately senior, had canceled 10 days before departure due to a scheduling conflict that most people suspected had more to do with reluctance to speak technical German than with any genuine calendar problem. Nolan had applied for the program 3 months earlier, filling out the internal nomination form and submitting it with a cover note explaining that the Kessler work calibration methodology was directly applicable to the tolerancing issues he had been flagging since spring, and Preston had returned the form with a single line of feedback indicating that the program required a candidate who could represent the company at an executive level. The Kessler work message told Nolan the slot remained open, that his name had come up in a technical review of documentation Blackthorn had shared with the program team, and that if he was interested, the program coordinator would need a response before 8 in the morning. Nolan read it twice, went home, sat at the kitchen table for an hour, and wrote 4 documents. A formal request for 50 days of unpaid leave addressed to Human Resources, a handover memo addressed to Marcus and Eliza Monroe that ran to 11 pages, a list of 7 specific operational risks that required monitoring during his absence with the exact threshold values that should trigger escalation, and a brief note to Emery telling her he was going to Germany and that she should call him if she needed anything. He submitted the leave request at 5:45 in the morning, drove to the plant to give Marcus the keys to the technical documentation cabinet, walked Eliza through the full handover in person, and told both of them clearly that if the line showed variance above any value on the risk list, they should go over Preston's head and contact the equipment manufacturer directly. He had already written down the name of the Kessler work contact. Preston approved the leave request inside 40 minutes, apparently under the impression that Nolan was expressing frustration through absence and would return within the week, and Vivian received only a brief administrative notification that a senior maintenance engineer had initiated unpaid leave for professional development purposes. She did not ask for details. Before the plane reached cruising altitude, Marcus sent a single text message. Preston had just authorized restoring the assembly line to full operating speed, overriding the reduced-rate protocol Nolan had been running for 6 weeks. For the first 7 days, nothing appeared to go wrong. Eliza Monroe was working through the handover documentation and holding the floor together with the particular competence of someone who understands a system well enough to keep it running, but not yet well enough to know which of its behaviors are normal and which are symptoms of something accumulating below the measurement threshold. She caught 3 minor alerts in the first week, cross-referenced them against Nolan's notes, and resolved all 3 without needing to escalate, and the experience gave her a quiet confidence that she later described as the most dangerous feeling she'd had at that job. The sensation of managing something she didn't fully understand and having nothing immediately break as a result. Preston stood in Vivian's office on day 5 and told her that Nolan's departure had effectively proven the facility was not dependent on any single individual, and Vivian, who was managing simultaneous calls with institutional investors excited by the contract announcement, took that assessment at face value because it fit the story she had been trying to tell about the company's operational maturity. Output numbers that week were actually higher than the previous week's baseline, which was the direct result of Preston having restored full line speed and quietly skipped 2 of the 4 quality sampling intervals Nolan had built into the shift schedule, a shortcut that produced better short-term figures and removed from the data record any early signal of what was building inside the components moving through the press. In Stuttgart, Nolan was standing in front of the most precisely instrumented calibration rig he had encountered in his career, watching a Kessler work engineer demonstrate an adjustment sequence that immediately explained three behaviors he had observed in the Blackthorn line for years and never been able to fully account for, and he experienced the specific satisfaction of a question finally answered that had taken years to form clearly enough to ask. Dr. Graham Faulkner, who ran the Technical Partnership Program, and who had spent 30 years working between American manufacturing facilities and German precision engineering shops, watched Nolan during that demonstration with the careful attention of someone who recognized a particular kind of engineer. Not the kind who knows everything, but the kind who has spent so long with one system that the system has become a language, and who immediately begins translating new information into that language at the speed of a native speaker. On day 7, a customer in the Pacific Northwest sent a routine field report to the Blackthorn quality team, noting that 3 prototype modules had failed their extended duration stress test. After 200 hours of operational load, approximately half the expected service life, and the quality team forwarded the report to Preston, who filed it under pending review and did not forward it to Vivienne. Eliza found the anomaly on day 9, and it looked at first like a sensor calibration drift, the kind of thing that happened regularly and was usually corrected in under an hour. She pulled up Nolan's notes on the thermal press and found a section 7 pages in that described precisely the behavior she was now observing, a compound variance pattern that emerged when ambient temperature exceeded 78 degrees Fahrenheit, and the primary sensor array had been running more than 40 hours without a manual offset correction, producing components that passed every automated quality check at the time of manufacture and were statistically likely to develop stress failures between 150 and 250 hours of field operation. The note included a recommended corrective sequence, a recommended inspection interval, and a highlighted sentence stating that the issue could not be resolved permanently without a firmware update to the press controller and a full recalibration of the sensor array. Eliza brought this to Preston and asked to reduce line speed by 12% and schedule the inspection. And Preston told her that the pace reduction would put the company below the weekly output commitment built into the new contract, and that he needed her to adjust the quality sampling protocol so that the variance stayed below the threshold that would trigger an automatic escalation flag in the reporting system. Marcus heard the conversation from across the floor, walked over, and said flatly that adjusting the sampling protocol to hide a real variance was not a solution, and Preston responded that Marcus was welcome to transfer to the overnight shift if he found the current management approach disagreeable, and that the decision had been made. Eliza sent an email directly to Vivienne's assistant that afternoon, describing the technical situation and requesting an urgent review, but the message was routed by the operations coordination system to the facilities management queue, where it sat behind a dozen other tickets tagged as non-critical. In Stuttgart, Graham was reviewing documentation from the Kessler Work technical database and handed Nolan a printed report, asking him to confirm whether the data was from Blackthorn Mobility because the methodology was distinctive and the production signatures were recognizable, though the author field on every page listed the operations integration team rather than any individual name. Nolan confirmed the documents were from Blackthorn, and Graham then showed him a second document, a technical advisory that Kessler Work had issued 6 months prior to all facilities operating the German-manufactured thermal press, specifically recommending a firmware update to address a known drift issue in the sensor response curve under high ambient temperature conditions, sent to every registered contact on file. At the bottom of the acknowledgement log, one name appeared in the received column, Preston Caldwell. The formal rejection of the shipment arrived on a Tuesday. A freight carrier returning 16 pallets of blackthorn components after the receiving quality team at the customer facility ran their incoming inspection and found that the reject rate on the production batch was 14%, which was 7 times the contractual defect threshold. Preston spent the next 3 hours preparing an internal report that described the incident as an isolated quality variance attributable to a transition period in the maintenance leadership structure, and he sent that report to Vivienne with a note suggesting the situation illustrated the risk of allowing a key technical contributor to leave on short notice without adequate knowledge transfer. A framing that placed the cause of the problem on Nolan's departure rather than on the decisions Preston had made during it. Vivienne called Nolan's cell phone 4 times over the course of the afternoon, and Nolan, who was in the middle of a live calibration session at the Kessler work facility with 3 engineers who had driven 3 hours for the session, did not pick up. When he saw the missed calls that evening, he responded by email. The warning for exactly this failure mode was documented in the handover notes. On page 4, the corrective action was outlined on page 7. Eliza and Marcus had the authority and the information to stop the line and conduct the inspection, and the company should contact the Kessler Workey technical team directly rather than waiting for him to manage a factory floor issue from another continent. Vivienne read the email 3 times. And each time she read it, she felt the same uncomfortable recognition. Not that Nolan was wrong, but that his being right meant something about the situation she hadn't wanted to look at directly. Preston told the executive team the following morning that the email response demonstrated Nolan had effectively abandoned his professional responsibilities and was using the company's operational distress as leverage, and he suggested that if Nolan would not return voluntarily, the company should consider whether his absence constituted a breach of employment terms. Conrad Blackthorne, who chaired the board and who had been driving the contract signing since the previous spring as part of a strategy to increase the company's valuation ahead of a potential merger, called Preston after the executive meeting and told him to manage the situation quietly and to keep the field rejection numbers out of the weekly investor update. Nolan sat in his temporary apartment in Stuttgart that night and called Emery, and she listened without interrupting, and when he was finished, she said, "Dad, they only call you when something is broken," and he said he knew, and she said, "Then you already know what you have to do," and they talked about other things for the rest of the hour. At the Kessler work facility, a name placard had been prepared for a conference room presentation, and when Nolan walked in and saw it, he stopped and read it twice. Nolan Pierce, Lead System Specialist, Blackthorn Mobility. He picked up the placard and told the program coordinator that the title was incorrect, that he was a senior maintenance engineer, and the coordinator looked genuinely confused and said they had taken the designation from the documentation. Graham, who was standing nearby, watched the exchange with a particular stillness, and then said quietly that several documents Nolan had authored had been cited in formal technical submissions by 2 European manufacturers who had adopted similar calibration approaches, and that the methodology was being discussed in the field as a genuine contribution to the problem of thermal press variance in high-volume precision manufacturing. Graham then took a portfolio of reports submitted by Blackthorne over the preceding 3 years and showed Nolan that the author on every page was listed as Operations Integration Team, which he now understood was a departmental header rather than a real working group, and that all of the recognition and compensation associated with those reports had flowed to the COO's office. The offer from Kessler Work came 2 days later. A director-level position in systems integration, the authority to build his own technical team, a salary 3 times his current one, relocation support, and a scheduling arrangement that would allow him to remain in the United States until Emery completed her degree before transitioning to Stuttgart on his own timeline. Nolan read the offer carefully, set it down, went for a long walk along the Neckar, and when he came back he told Graham he needed time, because he was aware that his decision had to be based on what he actually wanted and not on whether he was angry at Blackthorn Mobility Systems, and those two things had become difficult to separate. Graham asked him one question: whether the company he was considering staying loyal to had been equally loyal to him, and Nolan said he appreciated the question, but that loyalty to the institution was not quite what was keeping him from signing immediately. It was loyalty to the people on the floor who were currently standing in the middle of something he understood better than anyone, and who had not chosen any part of what was happening to them. Vivienne was preparing a revised shareholder communication deck when her executive assistant set a folder on her desk and said that she thought Vivienne should see something before the presentation was finalized. The folder contained the original guest list for the contract celebration, printed on official letterhead, and attached to the top was a note explaining that Marcus Bellamy had submitted Nolan Pierce's name for inclusion 3 separate times through the formal event coordination system. Vivienne turned to the page with the final approved list, and there was Nolan's name, struck through in red ink, with a notation in the margin in Preston Caldwell's handwriting: maintenance staff, no executive relevance. She sat with the folder for a long time before pulling other records, performance histories, project logs, the internal awards and bonus distributions from the past 3 years, and what she found was a pattern that was difficult to look at once she understood its shape. 3 separate production crises over the previous 4 years had resulted in significant bonuses distributed to the operations leadership team, and in each case, the crisis had been resolved through technical work. The records attributed to the operations integration team, which she now understood, was a label. Preston had applied to any document he wanted to claim as a departmental product rather than as the work of a specific person. She called Nolan from her personal phone that evening, and when he answered, she told him she had seen the list and she apologized for the party. And there was a pause before he said, "The party isn't the problem. It just helped me understand where I stood." She asked what he meant, and he said that when a company only remembers you exist when the equipment fails, you eventually begin to understand the actual terms of the arrangement, and that understanding was clarifying. She was still sitting with what he had said when her phone buzzed with a notification from the company's banking partner. The credit facility had been suspended pending review, triggered by the customer's formal notification that it was temporarily pausing the contract pending resolution of the quality findings. Vivienne went to the factory floor on day 30 herself, without announcing the visit, and she walked through the facility in the clothes she had been wearing to a board lunch that afternoon, which were entirely wrong for the environment and which she noticed and decided to ignore. What she saw in the plant was different from what the weekly operations reports had been describing. 2 of the 4 primary assembly lines had been halted. Pallets of rejected components were stacked 3 high along the east wall, waiting for disposition. 2 technicians were sitting in the break room at 11 in the morning because their shift had been cut, and no one had told them to go home, and Eliza Monroe was standing at a workstation with a printed calibration chart in one hand, and a look on her face that Vivienne recognized from her own worst months. Marcus brought Vivienne into his office, closed the door, and set a binder on the desk that contained every shift log, every maintenance request, every email and system ticket that Nolan had submitted over the past 8 months related to the thermal press. Not the versions that had appeared in board reports, but the originals, which were significantly more detailed and significantly more alarming. and which included language that the board reports had simply cut. Eliza walked Vivian through the technical sequence using the handover notes, explaining that the compound variance Nolan had identified and been managing manually for 6 months was not a secret he had kept. It was a documented problem that had appeared in multiple reports and requests that Preston had either not forwarded or had forwarded in a form that removed the urgency. Vivian asked Preston, in the meeting that followed, why the reports she had received consistently showed quality variance within acceptable parameters when the actual production data showed something very different. And Preston said that the technical staff had been mischaracterizing normal calibration drift as a systemic issue to create cover for Nolan's departure and protect their relationship with him. Genevieve Harrington, the chief financial officer, pulled up the warranty claim data during the meeting and said that the actual cost of components returned or flagged in the field was tracking $41 million above reserve, and that if the customer formally terminated the contract, the company would breach the covenants on its primary debt facility, giving the lending bank the right to accelerate full repayment. Vivian drove home that night and retrieved from her email archive the last formal report Nolan had submitted before his departure, and she found on the first page, in a section labeled Summary of Risk, a sentence she had not previously seen. If line speed is not reduced and the calibration correction is not implemented, accumulated tolerance variance will produce detectable field failures between 30 and 45 days from the date of this report. Vivian called Nolan the next morning and asked him to come back, and he told her he would come back under one condition, and the condition was not about salary or title, it was operational. He asked whether the company had reduced line speed, contacted Kessler Work for technical support, stopped shipment of unverified components, and disclosed the actual defect data to the customer honestly and completely. She told him the board had not yet authorized the disclosure, and that Conrad had specifically instructed Preston to continue limited shipments while the issue was internally resolved. And Nolan said that in that case he could not be useful to her, because what she was describing was a situation where he would return, apply a temporary correction, buy the company 3 more weeks, and then have the same conversation again. And he had already spent several years learning that temporary corrections on a structural problem were not solutions. They were postponements that made the eventual failure more expensive. Vivian told him she understood his position, but that people's jobs were at risk. And Nolan told her he knew, and that those jobs had been at risk since the moment Preston overrode the line speed reduction on day 1, and that the person responsible for that risk was the one who had overridden the recommendation, not the person who had written it and then been told it wasn't welcome. Graham had offered to send a Kessler Work technical team to the Blackthorn facility at no charge as part of the partnership agreement, contingent on Blackthorn entering an independent quality audit, and Vivian had accepted that offer before calling Nolan. But Conrad had vetoed it in an emergency board session on the grounds that inviting an outside firm to audit the facility would signal to the market that the company could not certify its own production quality, which was the precise thing Conrad most wanted to avoid because the merger discussions he was conducting in parallel depended on the acquirer believing production capacity was stable and verified. Nolan sent Vivian a single follow-up message after the call ended, and it contained one sentence: "Tell the customer the truth first, then call me." Vivian spent 3 days in board meetings, legal consultations, and calls with the customer's operations team, and at the end of those 3 days she had done 4 things Conrad had explicitly told her not to do. She sent the customer's quality leadership a complete and unredacted account of the production issue, including the technical origin, the timeline, and the specific decisions that had led to the shipment of non-conforming components. She suspended Preston Caldwell from his operational duties pending a formal internal investigation. She formally accepted the Kessler Work offer of independent technical audit and confirmed the team's findings would be shared in full with the customer. And she instructed the finance team to halt all additional shipments until the independent team cleared them. Conrad called an emergency board session and told the directors that Vivienne had unilaterally compromised the company's negotiating position, damaged the customer relationship, invited an external party to access confidential production data, and removed a senior executive without authorization, and he moved to suspend her as CEO pending a governance review. Genevieve Harrington told the board that the alternative, continuing to ship non-conforming product while managing the customer through incomplete disclosures, carried a regulatory exposure and a liability profile that no directors and officers' insurance policy she had ever reviewed would cover, and that the approach Conrad was describing was not a strategy but a postponement of a significantly larger collapse. The board did not vote that evening but agreed to reconvene in 48 hours. And in the meantime, the customer informed Blackthorne that if a credible remediation plan was not presented within 5 days, the contract would be terminated and the matter referred to legal counsel. The 5-day window closed on the same date as the last day of Nolan's program in Stuttgart. Shared. Nolan landed in Cleveland on a gray Tuesday morning and took a car from the airport rather than calling anyone, because he needed to see the facility before he decided anything. The parking lot was half empty at 9 in the morning, which at a facility running 2 full production shifts should have been impossible, and the large banner that had announced the contract, 1.8 billion reasons to believe in American manufacturing, had been taken down, leaving 4 pale rectangles on the brick where the mounting hardware had been. He was standing outside the gate reading his phone when Vivienne pulled up, and she got out of her car and walked toward him, and she was not dressed for a board meeting. She was dressed like someone who had been at the plant since before sunrise, which she had been. She handed him a folder rather than speaking first, and the folder contained 5 documents: the full disclosure letter sent to the customer, the suspension notice for Preston, the formal audit request addressed to Kessler Work, the board-approved authorization to reduce line speed to the level Nolan had originally recommended, and a signed commitment from the CEO's office to restructure the technical department so that engineering could halt production without executive override when quality thresholds were breached. She told him she had done what he asked before calling him, and he looked at each page and then looked at her and said he could see that. Graham Faulkner and a team of 4 Kessler Worky engineers arrived at the facility 2 hours later, and Nolan walked in with them not as a recalled employee but as a technical advisor to the independent team, a distinction that was not merely semantic, because it meant his assessment of the situation could not be suppressed by any internal reporting structure. The first thing he asked for when he entered the production area was the calibration logs for the past 45 days, and the second thing he asked for was the baseline reference data he had been maintaining manually before his departure, and Marcus said very carefully that there was something the team needed to show him before they went any further. The calibration data for the preceding 6 months. The baseline reference values Nolan had been building through manual adjustments and logging after every shift was gone. Not archived, not corrupted by accident. The server logs showed a deliberate deletion sequence executed from Preston Caldwell's administrative account 4 days after Nolan had departed for Germany at 2:14 in the morning, followed by an overwrite command applied to the backup partition that had eliminated the most recent version of the recovery file. Preston, reached by phone by the board's outside counsel, denied any recollection of the deletion and suggested that the data might have been removed by Nolan himself before departure as a means of ensuring his own indispensability, a theory the access logs disproved within 20 minutes, because the last entry under Nolan's credentials had been a routine end-of-shift log entry at 11:47 the evening before his flight. The technical team spent 3 hours trying to reconstruct the reference curve from indirect sources: partial data in the quality management system, output records from the automated sampler, the configuration files in the press controller, and then Eliza, who had been sitting at the workstation running the reconstruction in silence, stopped and said she needed to check something in the storage room. She had remembered that 8 months earlier, during a training session, Nolan had connected a standalone diagnostic tablet to the press controller to capture a reference baseline before a software update, and he had told her at the time that he was saving a local copy as insurance because the server backup had been unreliable, and that tablet had been set aside when the update was complete and had never been formally decommissioned. They found it in a plastic crate under a steel shelf at the back of the parts storage room, still charged to 62%, and the data was intact. Nolan did not treat the moment as a personal vindication. He handed the tablet to Eliza and asked her to verify the data integrity and begin the reconstruction. And he took the production floor layout and divided the remaining diagnostic work into tracks. Eliza would rebuild the error curve, Marcus would coordinate the shift teams, the Kessler Worka engineers would assess the hardware, and Nolan would handle the integration layer. He sent Vivienne a message telling her the data had been recovered and there was a realistic path to restoring the line, but that recovering the line was not the same as certifying it, and certification would require scrapping every component manufactured during the high variance period. Conrad called the board meeting at 11 o'clock that night and arrived with a prepared resolution that would suspend Vivienne's executive authority, reinstate Preston on a temporary basis, authorize continued shipment under the previous protocol, and initiate arbitration with the customer rather than voluntary remediation. He read the resolution aloud and explained each provision with the fluency of someone who had spent decades making questionable decisions sound like prudent governance, and when he finished, he looked around the table and asked for discussion. Vivienne presented her case without theater. She laid the documents on the table one at a time in chronological order, beginning with Nolan's original maintenance request from 8 months prior, and ending with the server access log showing the deletion timestamp and the account name. And she explained what each document meant in terms of what the company had known, when it had known it, who had withheld it, and what the consequences of withholding it had been. Genevieve presented the financial exposure in the same direct manner. The actual liability, if the customer litigated, was between $60 and $90 million. The current insurance coverage limit was $40 million, and the gap would come from the equity of the company, which Conrad's proposed approach would make significantly larger. Nolan was invited to speak, and he spoke briefly. He said that Vivienne had made decisions he would not have expected her to make earlier in the year, and that he wanted the board to understand that the choice to tell the customer the truth before being caught had cost the company real money and real reputation, and that it had also been the only path that led anywhere other than a managed failure. Eliza Monroe spoke last, and she said she wanted the board to consider something that wasn't in any of the documents. The reason the company had been dependent on Nolan's manual corrections for so long was not because he had tried to make himself indispensable. It was because every time he had tried to build a real system, the proposal had been deprioritized in favor of output targets, and the company's real vulnerability was not the absence of any individual, but the absence of a structure that treated technical integrity as a precondition rather than an obstacle. The board voted that night. Conrad was suspended from the chairmanship pending review, Preston's termination was formalized, and Vivian retained the CEO position by a margin of 1 vote, while the customer extended the remediation window by 2 days. The next 4 days inside Blackthorn were the most organized, intensive work Nolan had managed in 11 years, and the difference between this effort and every previous crisis was that this time the work was being done transparently, every person on the floor knowing exactly what their task was, why it mattered, and what success looked like for their piece of it. Nolan put a whiteboard at the entrance to the production area and divided it into 4 tracks: hardware verification, error curve reconstruction, integration testing, and customer communication. And each track had a named lead and a named backup, and every update was written on the board in real time, so that no information existed only inside one person's head. Eliza worked through the first night, and by morning had rebuilt the error curve with enough precision that the Kessler work engineers could use it to set the recalibration parameters on the press. And when she presented the methodology in the mid-morning briefing, Nolan stopped the meeting and told everyone in the room that the approach Eliza had developed was faster and more accurate than the one he would have used, and that the documentation should reflect her as its author. The recalibration took the better part of 2 days. The validation runs took most of the 3rd, and by the morning of the 4th day, Graham was able to sign the independent certification confirming the line was producing within agreed specifications. The customer sent an inspection team to observe a production run. The run passed every checkpoint the team applied, and by late afternoon, the customer had agreed not to terminate the contract, though the volume commitment for the following 6 months was reduced by 30% as a condition of continuing, and the penalty for the quality breach had to be paid in full, which came to $28 million in scrapped components and remediation costs, a number large enough to hurt and small enough that the company could absorb it without triggering the debt covenants. Vivian told the board that the company had survived, and that surviving was the right word for what had happened, and that the next question was what the company intended to do with that survival. Because if the only lesson taken from the previous 50 days was that Nolan Pierce should be better compensated and given a grander title, then the lesson had not been learned at all. SCAD. 6 months passed. Preston Caldwell's termination was finalized after an investigation confirmed that he had deleted the calibration data, altered the quality sampling methodology, redacted material warnings from board reports, and claimed credit in official filings for technical contributions he had not made. Conrad Blackthorn stepped down from the board entirely when the investigation surfaced the unauthorized merger discussions he had been conducting in parallel, the terms of which would have paid him personally a structuring fee contingent on the contract valuation remaining above a threshold the accurate production data would have caused it to miss. The engineering department was restructured so that quality and maintenance leads reported directly to the board on production integrity matters and held unilateral authority to reduce line speed or halt production when specification thresholds were at risk. And a cross-training program was established requiring that every critical procedure be known by at least 3 people and documented in a format accessible without managerial approval. Nolan did not return as a Blackthorn employee. He incorporated an independent systems integration consultancy that contracted with both Blackthorn and Kessler work, worked on projects he chose, built a team of 6 engineers over the following year, and attached his name to every document his team produced. Vivian organized a gathering at the factory itself, not a gala, not a rooftop ballroom, just the facility common area with long tables and food from 3 restaurants the employees had voted on and an invitation list that started with the cleaning crew and ended with the newly restructured board, with everyone in between listed in no particular order of importance. Nolan's name was first on the printed guest list, which Marcus had prepared and which no one had struck through with a red pen. Nolan arrived in the clothes he wore to work, nodded to people he recognized, and found a seat near the production floor entrance. And when Vivienne stood to speak, she did not talk about contracts or market positioning or the Blackthorne family legacy. She said the company had spent the better part of a year learning that a production line does not run on ambition or capital. It runs on the people who show up when nobody is watching and do the hard and specific work of keeping things from going wrong, and that the company had been fortunate to have people willing to do that, and that it had not always been deserving of that fortune. She thanked Marcus and Eliza and the Kessler Work-It team and the floor technicians by name, and she thanked Nolan last, and she did not call him indispensable or irreplaceable or the person who had saved the company, because he had asked her not to, and because she understood by then why that kind of framing was its own kind of problem. After the gathering, Vivienne gave Nolan an envelope. Inside was a formal invitation to represent both Blackthorne and Kessler work at an international manufacturing conference in Stuttgart, and he read it and asked whether anyone had checked whether there was someone with more executive relevance available to send instead, and she smiled and said there might be, but there was no one who had earned the seat more clearly. Nolan said he would go on one condition. Eliza would attend as co-presenter, and her name would appear first on the materials, and Vivienne agreed before he finished the sentence. They walked out of the factory together into the cold November air, and Vivienne said she was sorry it had taken a near collapse to make her see what had been in front of her for a long time, and Nolan said the party had not been the wound. The wound was a decade of a company that only remembered his name when something was broken, but that the party had been useful because it had clarified something he had been too loyal to examine clearly, which was that goodwill directed at an institution that doesn't know you're missing from the guest list is not loyalty, it is habit, and habits can be changed. She asked if there was anything outside of the work they might be allowed to explore, and he told her he didn't make promises about things he couldn't verify yet, but that he was willing to find out, and he suggested they start with coffee the following morning at a place near the plant where no one would ask either of them to give a presentation. He stood for a moment before getting in his car and looked back at the building he had walked into before Vardon for 11 years. The same one that had left him off a list and then nearly stopped breathing when he stopped standing in the dark to keep it alive. And what he felt was not vindication and not bitterness, but the clean and specific relief of a man who had finally stopped measuring his worth by whether anyone remembered to put his name on the invitation, and who had come back not to hold the building up the way he used to, but to help build something that would not need one person standing alone on the factory floor to keep it from falling down.